Grief is often the first time where it's like, it's the first thing we can't run from or hide from.
Right.
It's there at the end of the day. It's there at the end of the bottle. Like, it's there. We can't get away from it.
Hi, I'm Lily Cornell Silver, and welcome back to Mind Wide Open, my mental health focused interview series. Today, I am talking to Monique Minahan, who is a writer, mother, yoga teacher, and creator of the Grief Practice, which is a trauma-informed yoga that welcomes grief. Monique shares really powerful insight into what grief is and how it intersects with our mental health, as well as how that manifests for us somatically. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy. Hi, Monique. Thank you so much for being here. So as most know, grief has been a really significant part of my journey with mental health and just my life journey thus far. And around the 1 year period that I lost 3 loved ones to suicide, I also lost 2 grandparents to natural causes. So I'm super familiar with like the different facets of grief and the different forms that grief and loss can take. I became familiar with your work a couple years ago when a therapist recommended that I follow you on Instagram at The Grief Practice. And I know that your decision to get into this field was rooted in your own journey with grief and loss. Could you give some background on your own experiences and how you came to start in this field?
Yeah. When I was 25, my husband suddenly died. Mm-hmm. And it was, for me, a really devastating experience because I often think that the way that we experience grief is rooted in all of our previous experiences, like what we bring to that moment. And so for me, I had struggled with major depression since I was a teenager. And when he died, I had been on antidepressants for about 5 years. So I didn't have a lot of what I call resources. And because I was so young, this was back in 2002. And so there wasn't like the grief support community, especially virtually, that there is now. I, at the time, was in more of a talk therapy based, I was on antidepressants and I also was in talk therapy. And, I understand now that was not what I needed at the time because I was having an overwhelming experience, right? All of my biology and physiology is in survival and threat mode. And here I am going and trying to somebody's trying to talk to me about it will be okay. How do you feel? I don't even have words for how I feel.
Right.
And so for me, something like yoga was I could move some of that energy that had been kind of mobilized, but not fully able to cycle through that practice. And then also get in touch with feelings that didn't have a name. There's lots of things we can give, depression or sadness, but there's lots of, both and feelings that don't have words. But we know they're there. And so over time, I was able to get to a place where I felt like, okay, now I can start to integrate the words and the experience and the feelings and all of that. It can make things, I'll say worse in a way if we try to force these words that are not our lived experience.
That's something that I talk about in therapy all the time. And if my therapist is watching this, she's going to laugh. Because something that she has to remind me of all the time is you can't think your way out of how you're feeling. And she's like, yes, that's all great. And it's super good to label those experiences, but none of that, you can do that for hours and hours and hours. And it's not going to negate your emotions. It's not going to get you out of that process of having to actually feel the feelings.
We're so good at talking about how we feel and not so good at feeling what we feel because it's hard to feel. Yeah. And so much of the wellness world is we're so good at feeling better, but not necessarily feeling. So yeah, I felt very alone in my experience and very misunderstood. And so it went from bad to worse for several years. And there was a good stretch where I was, definitely suicidal and just felt like there was no way through. There wasn't anything on the other side of this experience. That is a lot of motivation for me just to keep being a voice in the sea of voices.
It was absolutely my experience with grief and loss was that feeling of isolation and that feeling that no one can really understand what I'm going through and that I don't have the support that I need, even though I had a huge support system and had my resources. I think there's almost an irony in that because basically everyone on the planet experiences grief and loss at some point, and almost everybody also experiences that feeling of of isolation. Could you speak a little bit more to your experience with isolation and how you found a community within that, or how you coped in those moments?
Yeah, I think of it a lot as people were trying to help me, but they didn't know how to connect with me where I was. And so it didn't reach me where I needed to be reached and in the way that I needed to be understood. And there was a lot of, I think we all experienced a lot of trying to fix it or make me feel better. And
Totally.
and that just isn't, as we know, I think,
Yeah.
very useful, because
Yeah.
there's nothing to fix. It's such a tremendous human experience. For me, when I started to explore yoga about 5 years after my husband died, and it provided this framework where I was able to get some embodied resources, kind of connect and notice what was happening in my physical experience. And so I just all of a sudden was able to see a new way through. From there I started to find, community and just a way forward that I had never imagined before. But it definitely had to completely collapse for me to, find a way through that.
Grief and loss really shaped the way or changed the way that I deal with mental health. Because it's all intertwined, but they're still separate experiences. It's grief isn't necessarily a chemical imbalance. So what has been your experience with mental illness or mental health issues and grief? Like, how do you carry those simultaneously?
After my husband died, I would have these, I call them like the loop. It was like these visuals and memories that it was like a broken record, and I would have them for the day. They would drive me crazy, and it wasn't like I didn't feel like I had a choice to stop the replay. It would just kind of accost myself. So I feel like, in grief, it's normal to have memories, and like there'll be sad memories or good memories or whatever, but that kind of replay, like broken record,
obsessive thought,
is more in the line of a trauma response. And so those are things that can definitely be worked with an appropriate kind of therapy and a therapist. One of the hardest things can be to open and let ourselves love in any capacity again, because it's such a vulnerable thing, and there's a lot of fear around that. That's my experience.
So you are a practitioner of somatic experiencing, right?
Right now I'm in the training to be a somatic experiencing practitioner.
Cool.
And what I've been doing so far is weave a lot of somatics into the trauma-informed perspective that I take, whether it's grief-specific yoga or other pieces, because that's such a fascinating thing to me. It really helped me understand not only my own experience, but just how human beings respond to tremendous loss, and that there's nothing wrong with the way that we respond, and it's so unique, but also universal. Like hope is, it's in our DNA, and sometimes it's easy to forget that or not even understand that it's there.
Cool. That's beautiful. So because what grief and loss really look like is such a stigmatized thing in society, as we know, there's a very limited understanding of how it shows up in mind, body, and spirit. And that's something that I still really struggle with deciphering in my own experience. Could you give some examples of how grief manifests in the body, whether it's personally for you or just how it might show up for others?
I think because our society doesn't really think in terms of, we're very literal, and we're very more favoring more of the cognitive process and making our way through things, that we don't give enough credit to the biological response to loss, which is, it's a threat to our survival often. And when our bodies perceive a threat, we have a whole system that starts to come online to help us through that, to help us survive. The biological response of the nervous system responding to a threat or a lack of safety, or however we perceive it, then turns into a physical experience, right? We might feel our heart racing. We might feel like a sinking in our stomach. We might have gut issues. There's lots of ways that, that can manifest physically, but we can't think our way out of how we feel.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons, but we can feel our way into a new state of thinking.
Something that you preach a lot and that you spoke about just now is how nonlinear grief is. And I think that's something that's so widely misunderstood, but is one of the main aspects of grief. You were saying that you it progressively got worse for you, your feelings of grief. And that was definitely my experience after I lost my dad. I was so completely locked up. I was in such a state of shock, but I was super high functioning. I was doing my college applications. I was back in school. I was working a lot. And then around that 8-9 month mark is when I tanked and was crying constantly, couldn't get out of bed, was super dissociated, experiencing really intense depersonalization. And societally, that's kind of around the time where people expect you to just be getting better. That's the time where people are like, okay, it's been 8 or 9 months, like move on, whether you're okay now, like you should be back to being a functioning human being. Could you talk a little bit more about your experience with, kind of with things progressively getting worse and how you manage that?
The fact that we don't, as a culture, respect that process, that it ebbs and flows just like waves. And so there's sometimes that things are better and there's sometimes that things are worse, and it doesn't mean anything's wrong. Mm-hmm. But yeah, mine definitely was, I think of it as like the first 4 or 5 years, mm-hmm. or I always call it stuck, until I came across this phrase by a psychologist, and his phrase uses is stuck, not broken. Right. Mm-hmm. I always thought of like stuck as like, it was this wasted period of my, 5-year chunk of my life. Yeah. But then I really, stuff is happening even in that stuck period. Yeah. Think of like babies in the womb or seeds in the ground. Like there is a lot that happens in the nothingness. And, I think that shows up in a few different ways. I noticed, years later, so I remarried 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I have a son who's now 6. And when I had my son, what I noticed was that the feelings of love, that I had for this human were very similar to my experience of my feelings of grief, in that they were very like overwhelming, and they felt like I couldn't control them, right? Like I couldn't, like feeling you will go here and
right. Yes.
So I feel like so much of our like it is what it is, but grief is often the first time where it's like, it's the first thing we can't run from or hide from.
Right.
It's there at the end of the day. It's there at the end of the bottle. Like it's there. We can't get away from it. And it's the first time we have to actually face something that we can't, find something that feels better or distracts us in a way that we can manage and get through it. It overwhelms us often.
Right.
For me, it's been 18 years, so I've had a lot of time to kind of notice how it's checked in and changed. Right. And when I met my now husband, mm-hmm. I noticed that I was able to unpack pieces of my experience of grief in a new way, because I now had, a new sense of safety, because I had
totally
mm-hmm. a regulation mm-hmm. of like this other person that felt safe to me actually felt safe. I think we put a lot of judgment on ourselves, as like, I should be over this, And I think of it as, there's a lot, especially in the, the wellness world, about letting things go and moving on. And I think that's, I don't buy into that, because I feel like we need to let it out. It needs to be expressed. Yes. Like integrated. Yes. But there's nothing to let go of. Like, this is a part of being human. To understand grief in the body is to understand hope in the body, because there's a reason why we feel stuck. It's like our bodies and our nervous system and all that's happening is always trying to keep us surviving and keep us functioning. And sometimes that means it limits what we can take in, right? Sometimes it means that it limits our capacity for joy. And because it also limits our capacity to feel this deep pain, mm-hmm. Which is where I think the, like some of the somatic based either therapies or practices are useful, because they allow us to have a graduated experience. Sometimes, we've been kind of swept away by this big wave. And so we don't even, the water in general, it can be very scary. And so we have to kind of retrain our system, our nervous system, to be able to sit with a piece of that experience, and maybe even a very small piece.
Yeah. And I think that idea of the body's responses being there to protect you, and as a means of the body trying to help you survive, is something that I've really had to grapple with. And after that period that I was talking about where I was pretty numb and in a state of shock and very high functioning, and I was being rewarded by society for being very high functioning. And after that state, when inevitably I broke down and I wasn't able to keep that, level of high functioning going, I experienced really intense dissociation and depersonalization, which is for me manifested as feeling as though I was like on drugs all the time, or that I was in a dream and nothing felt real. And that's like one of the scariest experiences I've ever had, because it lasted probably 3 or 4 months consecutively of every single day and every experience I had just not feeling real. And that's when my suicidal ideation started, because I was like, I can't live this way, but, and at the time, and we've spoken about this, losing that part of your brain that tells you this isn't permanent, and in that time, I'm like, okay, so this is my life forever. And this is how it's always going to be, because that's what happens in grief. You lose that part of you that's like, this is a temporary experience, because all experiences are temporary. Looking back on that experience now of how dissociated I was and how intense my depersonalization was, I recognize it as my body literally doing the only thing it could to protect itself, because so much grief came pouring in that if my body had tried to process it all at the same time, it was impossible. And it couldn't have done that. So that's something I try to keep in mind. Even the things that feel really negative are my body protecting itself.
Yeah. And that's such a powerful experience, I think, for people to probably hear and understand that, they have many people have had a similar experience, and that it's not, we're not going crazy. Even
yeah.
But yeah, parts of our brain go offline depending on the nature of our experiences, especially when they're overwhelming, that's all that trauma is. It's something that overwhelms our ability to cope. When I started to do more of a embodied practice, were things that, like, yes, they were useful in processing my initial experience of loss, but even as life went on, I've had 4 miscarriages, and like the things that were anchoring it was the real life experiences that I was able to sit with. It wasn't like in my yoga practice, they're useful there also, but it was like, crying on the kitchen floor, or like, being in intense emotional or physical pain. And so I think that, to learn things and to continue to adapt to whatever feels supportive, like truly feels supportive, they're lifesavers, because even when we're by ourselves, we can connect to those if they're already part of our, experience, of our lived experience.
How do you manage your depression now?
It's been an interesting path for me, because after my husband died, I stayed on antidepressants for another 5 years. So it was total. And then I just decided I didn't want to do this anymore. And so I went off of them, and it was very scary, because I thought, what's going to happen now?
Right. Yeah.
And at that time though, I had, had yoga, I had surfing, I had a lot of activities to kind of counter, which I didn't have any of those before. I didn't really notice any, backtracking with depression. I definitely felt like I was able to now have the things where I could help myself if I needed help. So I went through a phase where I was really into it's called regulation, where it's like, I'm trying to, I'd have a stressful day and I'd come home and I'd juggle, balls and walk, balance on my garden boxes, and go upside down. I mean, there are there's no end to the list of tricks that to, bring my whole brain online and all this stuff. And I went through a big phase, and I was like, this is great.
Turned into like a circus performer.
basically. And then that was before I went into and I was like, this is great. I've got a trick for everything. And then I was like, it's time to go back. I'm ready to do more to kind of revisit therapy. So that's when I started to go back to somatic experiencing practitioner for my own therapy. And that's when I really was like, I don't need to regulate. I don't want to regulate my life away. I didn't have a capacity. I had a capacity, but I didn't know how to hold things that felt too much. And I know that with the right support and with the right graduated process I can have a bigger capacity for love and for relationship and for life. And I just kind of, at my age, I'm 44, I felt like if I have 40 more years, this is, I think this is not a dress rehearsal. Like,
Yeah.
I would like to explore, my full capacity for being a human.
Yeah.
The only reason to go diving into old, pain and old traumas is if you're looking for a better quality of life. But it's hard. It's not, it's not an easy conversation for sure.
Totally. And that's a huge part of what I appreciate about your work, and something I'm wanting to do with this series is provide as many people as possible with that vocabulary and with that languaging and knowledge of how to support yourself in those experiences, but also support others in those experiences, to kind of negate some of that isolation that we feel. You provide a ton of information, and it's super accessible. And that's like the key word that I'm going for with this series is accessibility. So are there any tools and practices or some of those regulatory or like anchoring things that you could provide to the people watching?
Like standing up and balancing is one of the, I do a lot of balancing, because when you balance physically, I'll just give a really short little explanation. Like, there's a lot that happens. Your core has to pull into itself. Like, your brain has to, organize and communicate with your body, so that the most important thing is not to fall. And even though it's a super simple thing, it actually demands a high level of attention, which is mindfulness, paying attention. Right. And so it's a really easy way to get here right now. And it's not that we need to like stay here forever. It's just that it can give us like a pause to look around and go like, oh, like, what do I need here? Not what do I need from back there or from the future, but what do I need right here? But another little practice I love to do, I do it in airports when I'm standing in the TSA line, because it's so stressful.
It's so stressful.
But just looking around, I look around when I'm in the airport, and I look around for 3 or 4 things of the same color. And I often start my yoga classes like this, where I'm like, look around your space, and find 3 blue things, or, and all that does is, one of the ways that humans feel safe is by orienting. If you ever see someone walk into like a party or a room, the first thing they do is look around, because that's how we assess, neuroception, that's how we assess, one of the ways we assess safety. Yeah. And so when we're, kind of in our experience and not really aware of where we are right now, looking around at physical objects can be a way that not only reminds our bodies that we're here, but also like reminds our bodies that it's okay right here and right now.
What's something that's giving you hope right now, or bringing you hope?
The first thing that comes to mind is the voice that I've been seeing. So my husband watches a lot of basketball. We're Laker fans, and I used to watch a lot of basketball, not so much now. But I have been just so impressed by the voice that they're giving to, not only grief, but also to the Black Lives Matter message. That gives me hope, because I feel like, I always think of these conversations are not, it's wonderful if somebody's an expert or has a particular education, but these conversations, it's not for a certain group of people. It's for humans. And, we need, as just anybody can sit with somebody and be really present and listen and not try to fix them. And that's what we need more of. And I think, like an organization or individuals with a major platform like that, really not, not sugarcoating it and saying it as it is kind of, it's a wake-up call to a lot of people, but there's no turning away. And sometimes the discomfort is a useful thing. And so I just feel like that, I guess maybe because that's been a part of my process, is to like find a voice and find the courage to have, to keep the voice and all of that. And I just feel it's very inspiring for me to see people in their own way, kind of making it a bigger conversation, because otherwise it's, we don't want these conversations to fizzle. We want to keep awareness around them.
Totally. Well, thank you so much for being here. It truly means the world to me, and I'm really, really happy I got to connect with you on this level, because I've been an admirer from afar. for quite a few years, and your work really has changed my experience so much, and the accessibility of it means a lot to me, and it's super inspiring to me. So thank you so much for being here, Monique.
Thank you, Lily. I so enjoyed this.
I did too.